Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
You can tell Aaron is in far north Queensland because his video is misty, like there is a humidity somewhere.
The fog of 10% humidity that is far north Queensland. Yeah, it's warm up here today.
Yeah, it's supposed to be warm here too. Time will tell.
I'd like 12 degrees, double digit.
Yeah, look, if we could get to that record high, that would be great. But spring has sprung, so I can't complain. At least it looks pretty outside.
Last night's storm season arrived in Brisbane with a tornado.
Oh,
I'm sure it wasn't quite tornado-ish, but at 1 o'clock in the morning when it's like the Wizard of Oz out the back.
I used to have nightmares about that scene from the original Wizard of Oz, that storm scene. Like, I always thought that was going to happen to me. And I just used to have dreams of that wicked witch on her bicycle. Yes, exactly. Yes.
So. It's funny looking back at childhood movies, just how violent and horrific some of the things are.
Nursery rhymes as well.
Yeah.
Very dark.
Where are you, Jack?
I'm in Adelaide, still in Adelaide at the moment. So it's not warm enough to not have a jumper on, but it's definitely warmer.
He just can't quit Adelaide. He just can't.
Yeah.
Can't quit you. All right. So shall we jump into some news for this week?
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Okay. I feel like ignoring it or not jumping straight into it would be ignoring the elephant in the room. So I feel like we should start off with Qantas.
Yeah, it's definitely made the news. I opened every newspaper online this morning and headline after headline after headline is Qantas. So absolutely topical for us to chat about.
And what I'm excited about is that not only is it a big news item at the moment, there are so many lessons for early stage and scaling businesses that I think make it exciting.
Yeah, and that's why we're going to talk about it today, because we're not journalists and otherwise it really wouldn't be worth us talking about on a podcast. But we do think there are some lessons from this. So just to recap for people who perhaps, for the 5 people in Australia who are not paying attention to what's happened to Qantas, they've had quite a tumultuous time over the last couple of weeks. So they started out posting a record profit. I think it was something like $1.7 billion. And I'm sure when they posted that profit, they were expecting that would be met with wide applause and genuine support. But it has quickly dipped since that first kind of good news announcement. Firstly, I think there were little Twitters around that posting like, okay, that's great for Qantas shareholders, but customers have had their faces ripped off with the cost of airfares, which perhaps led to that. So there was some grumblings around the edges. But then fairly quickly thereafter, we had the CEO of Qantas, Alan Joyce, appearing before a parliamentary inquiry about the cost of living crisis. And obviously one of the things that have come into the cost of living discussion is airfares. And I think his performance in that inquiry was characterised as weasel wording, ducking and weaving questions. But one of the kind of key things to come out of that inquiry was that Qantas actually were holding on to quite a large number of flight credits that had accumulated over COVID when people would book flights. Perhaps they'd been cancelled. Qantas, not wanting to be too disadvantaged, didn't give refunds but gave flight credits, but it had never been truly revealed how much these flight credits actually added up to until this inquiry. There was they really didn't want to tell the world what the quantum of those flight credits were, but it then came out after it's almost $500 million of flight credits that Qantas were holding on to, which were due to expire at the end of this year. And if people didn't claim them, that was just cash that Qantas was going to bank. And
it's on a backdrop prior to that of the government stopping competition against them with Qatar.
Correct.
And so you've got this confluence of not only is the government stepping in to help rip the face off Australians, then the profits, then the this,
Correct.
then the that, and a bit like a plane crash, it's never one thing that goes wrong. It's many things at once.
That's right. And sorry, Aaron, go on.
I was just going to say, particularly selling flights that were cancelled
And
already.
that's
So
the next thing that
8,000
came up
flights.
and out, which is, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so if anyone missed it, Qantas sold tickets on 8,000 flights that had been cancelled. Now,
Knew it was going to cancel them.
I knew would be cancelled. That's
Yeah,
right.
the customers didn't know this, just
No,
Qantas.
just Qantas. But how that can be allowed. But I think this highlights, so particularly in the current economic climate, like I'm a Qantas loyal customer, and the customer experience was just horrendous over the last few years, and airfares noticeably up. And I think this disparity between what they expected would be a positive news headline in terms of profitability and how well we've stewarded the company through this time, and completely misreading and just almost not caring about the fact that customers had been essentially screwed over.
Yeah. Now, Qantas, for some months, Qantas has been investigated by the ACCC for selling the tickets for those cancelled flights, and we'll see where that ends up. But I guess what we've seen is a pretty rapid and dismal decline in sentiment and perception and brand equity for Qantas in just 2 weeks, which has probably, it's ignited a disgruntledness that has been there for some time. But I think people are now out with pitchforks, and understandably so. And it's against a backdrop of course, a retiring CEO, Alan Joyce, who has been essentially trying to do a victory lap in the last year of his stewardship, who has now been forced to retire 2 months early, but not before he's been paid millions in bonuses, millions in shares for this period of time, including, by the way, him selling down his own shares into a Qantas buyback, and that happening at the exact same time that the Qantas board knew this ACCC investigation was going on. So look, there's lots to come out, lots that has come out, lots still to come out. Some of these things are allegations and not necessarily proven yet, and it's important that we state that. But I guess I just mentioned all of that to set the scene for what has been probably the most unprecedented fall from public grace that we've seen in an Australian company in a long time. So why are we talking about it? Because what has it got to do with VCs and startups? And I just do think there are some lessons to be learned from this. There's some observations that we've made that many others have made as well, and it's worth probably kicking a few of those around.
Totally. And I've got a little bit of a personal experience to share. So when I get annoyed, I get cranky, and then I write an article.
I can vouch for it. It's very true.
How you process is how you process, Don.
It was about 4 years ago. One of the things we're seeing play out here is the constant conflict of short-term versus long-term. What happens is once a company gets to a certain size and scale, it can start really concentrating on efficiency initiatives. And those efficiency initiatives can sometimes go too far and kill customer satisfaction. And so I, being a platinum frequent flyer, which means you spend a hell of a lot and effectively have no life and live on an airplane.
And this was obviously not now, this was 4 years ago.
Yes. And it was when they had just implemented the automation in terms of your baggage. One day I turned up, I knew I was cutting it a bit fine, but this is the airline that once, when I arrived late at Brisbane Airport, put me into a car and drove me out to the aeroplane on the tarmac. Highly effective brand loyalty kinds of behaviours.
Because you felt very special.
And I felt, I had my now wife at the time will often recant that it was the first time she realised that she wasn't in Kansas anymore, and is this really the person that was going to be functional given we can't even turn up to the airport on time? And I'm like, what are you talking about? We got a chauffeur. Anyway, highly effective behaviour, right? Keeping customers happy, costs a little bit more at the expense of efficiency.
Sure.
But then they implemented this new system, and literally I was about, because they've got the clock on there, about 30 seconds late. No, couldn't go on, couldn't check in.
Couldn't check your bags.
Couldn't check my bag.
Yeah.
And so I then went back to talk to the person that now just stands around looking at everybody struggling with the machines. And I'm like, I know I'm a minute late. And she said, oh, sorry, it's a new system in place. It's a computer clock. The second it ticks over, you're out.
Done.
And what type of fare do you have? Oh, it's not a flexible fare. Sorry, that's a forfeiture. You have to go and stand in that line to buy a new ticket. And you guys have hung around me for a little while now. You understand some of the emotional regulation challenges that I sometimes have. And now I'm in this line and I get up there and the next flight out, 30 minutes time, is like $380. So I've lost that. And I got so incensed afterwards, I sent an email wanting them to take away my platinum status so I was no longer captured by the bullshit behaviour of this airline. Now, obviously they didn't, I don't think anybody's ever requested that before, so they didn't process
They probably didn't have a system for
that request. But is it more efficient the second it goes to not let you check your bags? Absolutely. Does it probably improve on-time departures? Totally. Does it save costs? Absolutely. But those kinds of initiatives are at the expense of effectiveness for the customer. And time again, we've seen the CEO and board bring efficiency type initiatives. And what happens is that banks up over time, up until a point it seems like it was all very quick, but it's actually been 5 years in the making.
Yeah. Yeah. As we have seen a lot, these things happen very slowly and then all at once, which is exactly what has happened with Qantas's reputation over the last little while. But Qantas is listed, and I think that also brings with it some challenges of responding to shareholder expectations on a reporting schedule. And that is part of what breeds some of that short-termism that you started out talking about, Don, which I think is, how do we meet our forecasts? How do we make sure we deliver on X, Y, and Z, which definitely sounds like a noble and commercial thing to do. But what happens, I think, is slowly over time, and this is true in public companies and private companies, and we see this in our startups as well, is that it puts some of the longer term initiatives or some of the slower burn things or initiatives or things that won't necessarily translate to a profit or a bottom line equation get ignored or set aside or delayed because it does nothing to help meet these short-term metrics like share price and profits and dividends. And all of a sudden you've made some decisions which have blown up your brand, disenfranchised a whole workforce, a whole bunch of things that we've seen Qantas be accused of in the last few years. Any comments on?
And we see a pattern when early stage companies raise capital, all the energy goes into raising that capital. But there are forecasts in that capital raising deck. Then the raise gets closed, and meanwhile, 3 to 6 months of energy that wasn't on the business now goes back to the business. And what we often find is that those forecasts now is unlikely to be met. Now, some board members and some investors then apply the wrong pressure, because if you don't acknowledge that the world has changed a little bit and you pressure the founder to try and hit arbitrary numbers in the short term, then those pressures end up leading to some really bad outcomes. And so often what we try to do in that early stage of coming on board is, hey, do we need to do a bit of a reset here? Let's have a look at the situation. We don't want to make the world easy and just ignore what was said, but we've got to find that middle ground of what's the reality of where the business is today. So then that way we don't drive some of these behaviours that lead to poor outcomes.
It's interesting. I was looking for a study that I read once on they looked at the decision-making timeline of CEOs across different countries. And what I remember of it was that Australian CEOs and boards tend to look at decisions of a 12-month to 3-year event horizon, whereas in developing nations, it tended to be more 5 years to 10 years. And I don't know, Don, in your lifecycle work, if that... Well, actually, one of my questions, Don, was how long after that experience at the baggage gate was it before you wrote a blog post on organisational life cycles? But the actual question, I wonder if there is why is that correlation, other than publicly listed companies and those reporting timelines, why is that correlation there? It was just a curious thing I've never reconciled.
That is a good question. The first question, how long did it take? I had time sitting in the lounge waiting for the next flight. And
I think the bigger question is, how long did it take before Don started turning up before the 30-minute mark to check his luggage in?
no, this was the turning point that has made my integration into Tribe easier. That was the last time I checked baggage.
Yes. We
Right.
have it's not a policy guide, dear listener. I know we're going off on a tangent, but it's not a policy. But we use a lot of social pressure to make sure that no one checks luggage at Tribe.
And you soon learn you can spend 10 days in London with carry-on. Now, Laney's carry-on weighs 47 kilos, but putting that aside.
Have I ever lost my luggage? No.
Yeah.
No, that is true.
Is though that it shouldn't be that there is a decision to focus on profit or meeting short-term forecasts that means that you show contempt for your customers, right? Like there's got to be a middle ground between
that word. You know, I love that word. It's a red rag to a bull. Every time you use it, shouldn't.
But that's how it feels.
No,
if some of these things turn out to be true, charging customers for flights that Qantas knew were never going to go off the ground, not making it very difficult, i.e. almost impossible to claim a flight credit. I have been through this process. I never stopped traveling through COVID. I was one of the few people who was traveling from March 2020 every single week. And I have a lot of flight credits. Do you think I can find the email from 3 years ago that has the 11-digit code that I've got to use, and I've remembered the password and the expiry date of that for each of those? None of them are linked to my frequent flyer status. You can't do that. Like, they just
Make
so difficult. And
It is painful.
yeah, painful, because they don't want you to claim it, right? They want to make it difficult. And all of those things, I feel, do add up to essentially a contempt for the customer. They're not trying to make their product. Customers are pretty happy if they enter into a fair exchange of value. You've got a product I need or I love. I'm really happy to pay a fair value for that product. And if you treat them well through that process, then, you know, everyone's happy. But as soon as a customer feels or gets a sense that they're really being taken advantage of, it's a pretty short distance to them feeling they can see the contempt that a company has for them, even if it's not overt. And I just think that realization by the customer base about how Qantas has behaved, if some of these things turn out to be true, is one of those things that gets every company into trouble. Whether it is like a Theranos was the only startup I can think of that has shown the same level of contempt. That was fraud, which is very different to what we're seeing here with Qantas. But they had such contempt for their customer, they were prepared to give them a diagnosis that they knew was not accurate and was probably wrong for things that were life-changing, like their breast cancer status. And that is just contempt for your customer. And that is the quickest way to burn any brand equity that has been built up over the last, 30 and
But
plus.
I think there's a linking thing there. It doesn't, with a self-interest. In all of the different examples, what happens is self-interest defaults. And one of the challenges for organisations, whether they're early or Qantas, is once you start implementing KPIs and goals, what tends to happen is you then start to get remuneration structures.
Incentives.
And incentives based on that. Now, Theranos, what was the incentive? It's keeping a company alive. The product didn't work. Shareholder expectations, narcissism, we don't have to go there. In Qantas, as a fully developed organisation, as time goes on, you get more sophisticated with your goals and KPIs, which means you can get more sophisticated in remuneration structures to drive individual behaviour. Now, when we go and help the portfolio companies implement that, what I always try and do is make sure you have deterministic goals and constraint goals and connect everyone together, integrate them.
Can you explain the difference between deterministic and constraint goals?
Yeah. So the deterministic goal may well be for the part of the business responsible for baggage and on-time plane leaving. Let's say the airport. The deterministic goal will probably be something around on-time departures, will be around overtime of staff, will be asset utilisation. Yep. Deterministic goals. And if you solely give people remuneration based on that, they're going to be incredibly good at getting that optimized. The constraint goal that we want to give those same people is someone else's deterministic goal, which there'll be people around customer service, customer satisfaction, frequent flyer loyalty. And so if you start joining everyone at the hip, okay, 50% of your REM is going to be this deterministic goal, but you're also going to be remunerated for in-airport satisfaction. You two divisions are now tied at the hip.
Yep.
And what helps me but hurts you actually starts to hurt me. And so what we're always trying to do, even at that early phase, that first step of implementing KPIs and then REM, is never have a process that individualizes KPIs and goals. We want to tie everyone together, because then you get this interconnected culture, and the more you can bring customer satisfaction and effectiveness into it, the better off you're going to be. Now, some companies don't yet have the systems and process to manage those things.
Yeah.
So don't implement the KPI and the remuneration structure until you've got that in place.
Yeah.
And often when we begin looking at REM structure, KPI structures, half the time we'll actually find that we're not mature enough yet. We've actually got to go and implement those systems and process. And then you're more likely to build a healthy organisation that doesn't end up in this situation.
Yeah, and so the observation in Qantas's case is obviously CEO's REM was tied very strongly to share price. It's impossible not to tie a CEO of a listed company to its share price. But what you're saying is perhaps there should have been a lot broader set of KPIs and incentives tied to different goals other than the share price, because that's how you make sure that some of these other things are not left behind, like customer service, customer loyalty, workforce satisfaction, those sorts of things.
And someone the size of Qantas, we're not just talking about the CEO. There are thousands of people in there that have KPIs and goals connected to REM, and I would absolutely bet that there's not enough integration of different goals and KPIs across departments. And this is often, if it's just something that belongs to you and doesn't affect the customer or anybody else, you don't need this kind of approach. But anything that has a combination of external and internal, the more you can tie different parts of the organisation together and bring in non-financial, it's often the financial that always kills these. The more you can bring in non-financial metrics, the better you'll be.
I think it's such a good point. One thing I've seen is that separation between outcome versus at the cost of, like when those KPIs are sitting in different units and then they become factions at war with one another almost, just that conflict that arises, rather than when it's integrated and everyone's, to your picture you often use about the Vikings in the boat, people are rowing in the same direction.
And every company has it. Like in a manufacturing company I did, the stock levels is a big balance sheet item problem. And so if you can get stock all the way down, CFO's happy as Larry because their return on equity is amazing. But we tied delivery times and out of stocks to those people. And so suddenly now they're actually, I have to optimize, but not at the expense of this. And suddenly the cultural change just through that was quite impressive.
The group that set the incentive structures for the CEO are the board. So I feel it's impossible to have a conversation about Qantas's unraveling without talking about the board and its role in that whole process as well.
Totally. I don't even know where to begin.
I feel like we talk about the role of boards a lot.
No, but this is why I think we need to talk about it, because
Absolutely.
we talked before about the importance of a board, I guess, what happens when boards are dysfunctional. In this case, we've got a situation where the board seems to have stood very firmly behind every decision that Joyce has made over the last little while. And so I think they are equally, if not more, responsible for a whole bunch of these decisions that have been made. Alan was the one out there on the front line communicating this, but for sure, the board was well behind him, even insofar as what we have seen yesterday in their explanation of his early retirement, which we will get to. But this is not just the responsibility of a CEO. This is the culmination of a whole bunch of people on that board saying yes to all of these things. Now, how do you get to that point and be so completely not alive to how these will be perceived by your customer base, by the public, by the media, and every other stakeholder? Sorry.
No, and we said in the last time, the fish often rots from the head. And having said that, in my experience, and in a previous life, I worked with boards bigger than Qantas. Sorry, companies that had staff and revenues bigger than Qantas. And often the board doesn't actually know what's going on at those, especially at those operating levels.
In and of itself is worrying.
Yep. There's this balance between the concept of back or sack. So I'm going to back the CEO, or we don't, we get rid of them, and therefore we've got to leave them.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was wondering where that was going.
Yeah.
Now that I think through those words in my head.
No, great. You've defined it. Thank you. Sorry. Keep going.
You've either got to back them or you're going to sack them. Otherwise, your brand ends up in the cracks. Okay. And so what happens is traditional leadership theory to some extent has gotten to a point of we've appointed this person and therefore we've got to back them. But I think at the same time, there's a balance with you've got to inspect what you expect. And we don't know the inner workings of Qantas, but what I do know with my experience is often they don't have some of the reporting and some of that understanding that at least goes into some of these operational matters. And they form a risk committee, but risks that they're looking at are often
self-reported.
Yeah, but they're almost ethereal. They're often not at that level as detailed in the operations. And then they also get captured to the listed demands. Are we going to meet the numbers? Are we going to go and squeeze these things? And I so often find these people that become captured by someone that's delivering them short-term results because their time on that board is going to be defined. They don't want any challenges that could cause any brand reputation. So short-term thinking stays the order of the day and long-term thinking goes out the door.
Yeah, I think they're subject to the same challenges the CEO is. Share price, profitability, dividends, and keeping their shareholders happy. And they know their shareholders are the ones that vote them in or not or out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So incentive structures misaligned with customers again. And it'll be interesting to see what will happen over the next few days, whether the board changes as well as a result.
Yeah, and this sort of leads into some of the patterns that we often see is that I don't think that we're finished in terms of bad news coming out.
No,
what tends to happen is once we've got this kind of level, and then the bigger the ship, the harder it is to turn. And so once we started to get a pile-on, and I love the fact that we get great engagement from the ecosystem. And Luke Anear, who we've had on the podcast, reacted to some discussions and a post we had done, that you had done, Lainey, on one of the common patterns that happens is that the ex-CEO's stuff gets left behind for the current person to get stuck with. And the point that you and I discussed is that that often affects women coming into these leadership positions quite significantly, and the pattern that we see is they often don't get a fair break. And me looking at the pattern, the glass cliff, that's right. Me looking at that pattern had made a bit of a quip to you about, I have a sneaking suspicion that this pattern is going to play out again, partly because she was CFO, and I'd like to touch on what we see in these patterns.
Yeah.
Because she has been at this helm and some responsibility absolutely has to go onto her shoulders. But we'd made a comment, and Luke quite rightly had pointed out, hey, negative Nellies, let's give this lady a chance to actually demonstrate some leadership. And he's definitely right, because once the zeitgeist takes over and the energy starts to go in a certain way and everybody piles in.
I do want to talk about that media pile-on aspect, which I think we will get to, and tie in Luke's comment to that, because I think that's actually another lesson for a lot of companies to be aware of, that we can use Qantas as a lightning rod for. But just quickly, before we get to the new CEO who has started today, it has required the existing CEO to enter early retirement by 2 months, despite I feel like he was holding on with his fingernails to retain his role until his chosen time to retire, which had been pre-announced. But it did highlight one of the things that we also see founders grapple with a lot. So this is not new or limited to CEOs of big companies, founders having to make a similar decision, like when is the right time to go?
Yep.
When is the right time to hand the reins over to someone? And what is required in order to get yourself to a position where you accept that?
Yeah.
And I think that also dovetails into the conversation we're going to be having with Fred.
Yeah, sure. Aaron, sorry, you were going to say something.
No, just having seen a lot of friends go through that journey of founding something that is tied into their identity. It's part of their family. It's like a child. And then that moment where they start feeling like they're losing control or can't add the value, or there's a misalignment of vision that starts to creep in. One case I can think of in particular, or just bad behaviours. Like there's just that toxic relationship starting to develop. But yeah, I don't know of many founders that I could list straight away that have actually successfully navigated that without a lot of emotional turmoil, and I think still traumatized by it too, actually, if I think of a couple of cases I know, like long after. So it's a really challenging thing for a founder. It requires a lot of self-awareness. It also requires a lot of good management and communication. And in a time when there's a lot of emotional stress.
Especially if things are not going well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's one thing for someone to realise that they're no longer the right person to helm a company going forward when things are going really well. It's another to try and be forced to reach that same conclusion when things are not going well. I'm thinking of Travis at Uber and the absolute shit show that turned into, and the battle that was required in order to have him removed at that time because of the damage he was doing to the brand and the company, and which I still don't think has recovered really ever.
No, and I was going to say, I can think of companies where founders have been removed entirely or removed from CEO. In a lot of those cases, the company hasn't done well afterwards. Like, I think it's actually quite a challenging thing to navigate.
And is that, do you think, because of the myth or the mythology around that particular founder and their contribution? Or do you think by the time decisions get made, so much damage has been done that it's almost impossible to undo?
Yeah, look, it could definitely be the latter. But I think that there can be a lot of loyalties in the teams to a particular founder or co-founder, and even down to shareholders and others. And when that's removed, I don't know, there can be a very different culture. Yeah, I wish there's a couple of case studies I'd love us to talk about, but obviously can't talk freely about it without their permission. But yeah, absolutely challenging thing to navigate.
If we look at the founder transition,
and we're saying founder, but it could be CEO, whoever it is, the buck stops with them.
Yeah. But I think if there's a bit of a nuance between founders transitioning and then if the business has a CEO. So I'll try and break up those two. The challenge is that humans tend to wait for a burning platform of problems before acting.
Absolutely.
Like Adrian DeMarco, our venture partner and shareholder, he's like one of the few that has managed to go out on top. It's not easy to do. And
to know when to fold them, when to hold them.
Exactly. And what happens is, coming back to sort of a life cycle analogy, is that organizations, they grow, but there's this adolescence phase where the founder has to start letting the company grow up, get its own systems, its own processes, its own controls, and then often a GM, a CEO, or a CEO is appointed. They often wait too late for that to happen. And when they do it, they appoint someone to try and fit the well-tailored suit that the company is to them. Founders build things that are in their own image with people that they like to work with, doing things that they like to do.
Yeah.
And then when it is time, things aren't going well, some challenges start to happen. Often it's an investor or board taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, I think it's time that we move to that level. But that investor or board member thinks that they can just slide someone into this person's suit and it doesn't work. And so what you've actually got to be able to understand is that there are some ways to do it, and there are some normal conflicts, and there are some normal challenges, and you actually need a specific approach for founder transition. Otherwise, what happens is either the founder steps out, brings in some of that new energy. Have a look at Andrew Forrest at the moment, Twiggy. Revolving door of execs. They're always the idiot. They didn't get it. The founder comes back in, takes control, stays probably for another 12 or 18 months, hires someone new. It's this cycle that I've seen play out over decades with entrepreneurial families and founders. But what was actually missing was the systemic approach of that transition actually still needs some of the founders' entrepreneurial energy, but we also need them to get out of the way and build to allow the systems and process to be built. Now, Steve Jobs felt this in the first iteration of Apple, where before founders learnt not to give away control, Jobs got ejected from the system. In this day and age, with dual class shares and being able to raise capital without giving away control, what tends to happen is the founder can stay in control, and that cycle can then bounce back and forth. But the correlation with, say, an Alan Joyce or anybody they just waited too long. They didn't read the tea leaves, and they didn't have a process to healthily do it.
But I think one of the other things that this has shown is Alan Joyce is Alan Joyce, and there's lots of media commentators who like to talk about his personality traits. But I think there's also a bunch of people who are asked to leave their role, even if they've not done anything wrong, right? Like perhaps they're just no longer the right person, but more likely they've just lost the confidence of either the board, their team, the customers. And as unfair as it sounds, if you haven't done anything wrong, if you don't have those things, you must go, particularly if it's very clear that you can't get back the confidence of shareholders or your customers or your workforce. And I think it got to a point where that was undeniable with Qantas, but it becomes less obvious, I think, in smaller companies. And I've definitely been involved in companies where the CEO has had to be removed because they just no longer had the confidence of the team or the shareholders. They haven't done anything wrong technically, like they're nothing that you would dismiss them over. But if they can no longer lead that organization, then they are no longer effective. And as unfair as that might be or feel, the outcome is the same. And that's hard for people to grapple with, I think, particularly entrepreneurial people who are optimistic and the narcissists that walk among us as well. So Aaron is nodding in agreement. I can see in his face.
I'm not in agreement with any comments about narcissists, always.
But I think this is where the board needs to play a really strong role, right? So it is hard for a lot of people to get their heads around the fact that they might have to step down from their role. And so the board is really critical in helping them come to this decision. It's important to surround yourself with advisors who will be objective and tell you the truth. A lot of people really struggle with building around themselves this group that will tell them no, or tell them when they need to pull their head in, or to take the pulse of a shareholder or workforce or whatever, independent mentors, that sort of thing. So I think the way that you get some founders and CEOs to reach this conclusion is to have those sorts of systems and networks set up around you so you don't start to believe your own bullshit too much.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, because when you've built something often really successful, it's those turning points where you need to have that objective assistance that you have trust with, that can get some going.
The trust part's the critical part. So we've now got a new CEO who takes over as of today and who has inherited a shit show, but it's a shit show that she has been party to creating, given that she was CFO previously. So how did she proceed from here? I think that's, given the challenges and her need to set her own tone as CEO, that maybe is some learnings and insights that our listeners might find useful. I think, what's the challenges of being the person to take over, and how do they potentially go about it?
Yeah, it's a really good point for anybody coming into a situation where they're taking over as that leader. I guess if you break it down, for Qantas, she's got a lot of internal stuff that needs to be resolved, clearly. So one of the issues with the ACCC is they were selling tickets on flights that they had already decided to cancel. Now, in my experience, there are often two ways that those things happen. One, it could be nefarious. It could just be a cash-raising exercise.
Yeah.
Often, however, I find that it's not. It's actually different divisions and different departments in big organisations don't talk to each other, and decisions are made at the ground level in a disintegrated kind of fashion. And one team has decided, hey, we're going to be cancelling these tickets, and another team doesn't know about that and is still selling the tickets. And then later on, when you look at it, it comes out really poorly. Now, we don't know exactly how that's played out, and the evidence will come through the court case. But it's those kinds of things that often you're having to deal with internally, of how do you reintegrate an organisation? How do you break down those silos that are clearly leading to some poor outcomes? But then how do you do it in an environment where you've got a lot of external press, a lot of external pressures, a lot of comment, a lot of time pressure, and you've got to deal with the whole external environment and deal with the internal environment? That's really difficult.
Yeah, and I think I guess my concern is she's got the same board at the helm as of today, and they are the same people who gave a green light to all the strategic decisions that were made previous. So understand your point, Don. Board might not have had any insight into those sorts of things, or were likely not deep enough in the weeds to actually give a green light to that specific point. But I guess the way that the business has operated has very much been done with the green light and approval of the board, and she's still got the same board. Is she going to do business as usual, or will she take a new approach? And if so, how do you do that when you've got these same people at the helm who actually at the moment don't seem to be able to acknowledge that those decisions have not been received well by the public?
Yeah, and will there be changes to the rest of the leadership team as well? So will other executives be shifted? And I guess to your point before, Don, identifying causality of these issues internally and how these things have manifested. It'll be interesting to see how much of a leadership shake-up there is next. And on top of all that, rebuilding consumer trust and consumer sentiment, and probably under pressure to be seen to be doing something relatively quickly as well. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch.
She's going to need to get the board are going to have to back her. To the comment you made, Don, about backing or sacking, the board are going to have to back her to take a different route, and that means that they have to get out of the way of some decisions, maybe to do things differently. And she's going to have to develop a strategy and a vision that's going to get all of Qantas, like all of the workers, the customers, everything to rally around it. And I think that's going to be hard because they're already skeptical given the treatment that they believe they've been subjected to over the last little while.
Yeah, and I think the other thing for me is the fact that she's a CFO becoming a CEO. And Don, I'd love your perspective on this. My only experience with this was when Andy Penn came in at Telstra replacing David Thaugherty, and Thaugherty was very much the marketer energy and had introduced the Mura-D startup accelerator at the time. And then when Andy Penn came in, it was very much a bottom line driven, cost cutting. Very quickly, those innovation programs wound up. That was my experience of it. But yeah, I'm keen to hear what you both think of a CFO becoming CEO in this context.
Before giving my answer on that, I just want to remind people that all models are wrong. Some are useful. And I talk in generalities and using some frameworks, but...
That's Don protecting against all the CFOs writing in negative feedback now.
About what he's going to say next.
CFOs becoming the CEO of a company ushers in, under a couple of frameworks, what we would describe as the aristocracy phase. Because what happens is, with all due respect to CFOs, if you think of the PAEI framework that I've shared before of needing to produce, administrate, entrepreneur, integrate, you need all four of those ingredients. But what is the primary concern of A? It's administration, it's systems, it's process, it's costs. And there's a financial review podcast out talking about the financial engineering. And that's what happens with these companies in the aging phase, where instead of prioritizing prioritizing entrepreneurial endeavors, instead of prioritizing P, so producing results for customers, fantastic customer service, where do they go to? They go to A, systems, process, financial engineering. And when you have a look at a number of points with Qantas's balance sheet and bottom line, it's pretty easy to get a better result if you stop buying planes. It's pretty easy to get a result if you start culling a whole lot of resources and offshoring them. To my earlier story, it's pretty easy if you have a time clock that stops anybody checking in and then forces them to spend hundreds of dollars on a new ticket. And then A-style people have a tendency, it doesn't matter what size company, the A approach to leadership can sometimes, I'm talking in generalities, is often very clinical, it's often very systems, it's often very process orientated. And if you're living in a listed structure that has just delivered a record profit, make no mistake, there is still pressure to continue to deliver those results. And the tempting thing is to financially engineer your way out of it. So whether it's Telstra, whether it's GE, whether it's AMP, whether it's all these great brands that were product-led, customer service-led, had these leadership from the front, entrepreneurial, integrative style. Then when boards start pushing a bit more calmness, a bit more efficiency, let's squeeze the juice out of this lemon, then we start to see these behaviours. And it works for a while. You get record profits, you get great cash flows. But have a look at AMP, have a look at GE, have a look at all of these companies. That orientation of a lack of producing results for customers and entrepreneurial activities bringing forth results, the chickens come home to roost. And so my concern for her is not only is there the glass cliff aspect that I think we should definitely discuss, but it doesn't matter who was coming into this role. The reality is under pressure, people default to efficiency type strategies, but she's also been there for 30 years and the CFOs are often the engine room for all of these great ideas, much to the behest of marketing and sales and product-led people. They're the engine room for these ideas to boost cash flow, decrease costs, and her fingerprints will be all over it.
The concern I have, or the potential I see, is that what is actually required, even aside from some of the financial elements that Qantas will absolutely have to deal with, the fact that this CapEx spend was delayed and now she's going to have to deal with that. I think there will be big costs to Qantas as well to try and get back into the good books with workers and customers. I think there's going to be a financial cost to that. But I actually think what's needed as well is she's going to have to craft a narrative for customers that has to be authentic and will have to apologize for past mistakes and do that in a way that is very genuine. Like, doesn't seem like it's just lip service. It's going to have to come across as genuine contrition, because if it isn't, the public will sense that's a PR exercise and they will reject it. She's going to have to also get very much on the front foot to build a great narrative with shareholders, because she's going to have to prepare them for the fact that record profit that we saw this year, that's not happening again anytime soon. And here's the reasons why. And here's what we're doing about it. Here's why it will actually create more value for the business over the long run. But that's a difficult thing to communicate to shareholders in what she needs to do, which is actually a very short period of time. And she'll have to do a lot of shareholder comms because of the situation she has inherited and because of the situation which will inevitably occur in the next financial year. So there's no sort of time to waste about that, I think. And so those are very comms and EQ related things that are not necessarily, again, speaking in generalities, the strengths of CFOs, but she's going to have to do all of that. I actually think this is an incredibly tricky thing to have to pull off. And she may very well, and I very much hope she does. But
Absolutely.
it's, make no mistake, that's difficult.
Yeah, and I think in my previous life, if I was working with a board in this kind of manner, the very basic concepts here still come back to the stuff that we as a tribe constantly talk about, which is trust and respect. And what they've lost is trust and respect externally. So they have to have initiatives to do that. And they've got some trust and respect issues internally. And what they've got to be able to do is have some processes that unlock the entire organisation and integrate them together. So if there is, as I suspect, silo type behaviour that is leading to operational over-indexing towards efficiency at the expense of customers, one of the things I would suggest as an example is accept Qatar Airlines running a few extra flights into the country, because that's going to get rid of a whole chunk of narrative, which to me is absolute bullshit that a government is protecting a listed company. Like, it's going to happen eventually. Have a look at the pressure on the government. They're not going to sit there and not reverse this decision at some point. Just get on with it.
So there was a lesson in this for early stage founders. What would that lesson be?
I may have prepared a slide pack. I indulge you. Indulge you? Am I indulging you, or am I indulging myself?
No, we're indulging you, Don.
Okay.
The question was to indulge you.
I wanted to just share some broad concepts on the life cycle, because I think it ties a few things together. We had a comment from Anear, who we had on the podcast prior, on one of our posts that I think is fair to say got us thinking a little bit more. And so I put together just a quick thing, if that's all right, if I can find the share. We're going to actually be running a life cycles session for portfolio and non-portfolio in October anyway. So this is maybe a quick little introduction, but I just wanted to introduce one of the models that I've found that I quite like, which is the Odysseus one. There are multiple life cycle models out there, but I think the importance of sharing these things with entrepreneurs is understanding that parts of your journey are in fact incredibly predictable. And the beauty of that is that if some parts are predictable, it means you can know the road ahead. And if you can know the road ahead, you can actually drive a bit faster because you can be proactive on what's coming. And so in this model here, it is linking to the human life cycle. Now, some people say there's no way that you can link to the human life cycle. That's a bit bizarre. Companies have a body. It's called a structure. Companies have emotions. It's called culture. Companies have central nervous system, KPIs, goals, information flow systems. So there is a reasonable way of connecting the two. Now, when a company is first born, that sort of courtship aspect is the entrepreneur thinking through ideas, coming up with an idea, engaging with others, but then they take some steps forward, they take some risk. Happens, a business is born, and it enters that infancy phase. And like the human life cycle, that infancy phase is tough. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of sleepless nights. And in Luke's podcast, he talked about now looking back, and he didn't get enough sleep and that he should have prioritized more sleep. But that's a bit like parents of a newborn saying, we're going to prioritize sleeping 8 or 9 hours a night. Like, it's just never going to happen. Luke's business has now moved into the more go-go phase where the business is sleeping through the night, the baby's sleeping through the night. Now the parents can start to sleep through the night. And that's giving him a whole lot of energy, a whole lot of focus, and he's able to bring in some new ideas. And so each of these different phases, infancy, go-go, the adolescence phase, if you think of adolescence phase in organizations, what we often see, it's where the business is growing up now. We're now starting to get a corporate structure. We're now starting to get CEOs and general managers in place. And we start to see founders enter a period of conflict between them and the business. We often just see this energy loss, this destructive conflict occurring. Now, in a small percentage of businesses, founders are able to get through that, the business is able to get through that, and that's where we get to what we would describe as prime. It's a bit like humans getting through that difficult adolescence period so that we can get through to that sort of prime adult phase. But sometimes that adolescence phase actually spits out the entrepreneur. There's a divorce between the business and the entrepreneur. And it was more during the times of when founders gave up control of voting rights, you would often see this unfulfilled entrepreneur where they just lament what's happened. My business has been taken from me. I no longer see it. And then it enters a period of premature aging. And we've discussed when you lose a founder too early, when you lose that entrepreneurial energy too early, when that entrepreneurial energy isn't systemized, you end up in this premature aging position because the business no longer has that entrepreneurialism to it. And so then we get into the aging phase where the organization starts to just age. It's what happens to humans as well. I didn't think it would start as early as it did, but you lose flexibility. You start to fall a little bit and you enter this aristocracy phase, which is where I think Qantas have been, where what we're actually looking at is less about customer satisfaction, less about entrepreneurialism. It's all about rules and systems and process and financial engineering and how do we squeeze dollars. And if we shift buying new planes by 3 years, that'll bolster our balance sheet. And all of this kind of behavior just happens behind the scenes, and it's shareholders don't see it coming because the P&L is good, the cash flow is good, the balance sheet's looking not too bad. But all of these issues build up behind the scenes, and then one day it all becomes public and it feels like a river, and this recrimination phase ends up occurring where it's no longer what is the problem that we need to deal with, it's who created the problem, who is to blame. And I saw when Mr. Joyce announced his resignation, a number of politicians immediately started firing off at effectively the incoming CEO, attacking her before she's even gotten into the position of has been there, was part of all these things. Is she going to take accountability? Like, hasn't even had an opportunity yet to lead, and we're already in the recrimination period. Now, if handled well, you can get back from recrimination back to prime. And there are ways of doing that, and that's what my previous life used to be. But unfortunately, what tends to happen, like AMP, like GE, like all of these other companies, just have a look at their share prices and their history. A body in motion tends to stay in motion if you don't know how to get yourself out of a situation. And then one day it just ends up in bureaucracy where it has to be sustained from shareholders' funds, and ultimately the business disappears in the form that it was there. Now, what we're actually measuring and why this is relevant to early stage businesses is that we don't measure age here. I know companies that are 3 or 4 years old that are in that aging phase. And I know companies that are 100 years old that are still in the growing phase. What we're actually looking at is the relationship between two ingredients. One is when you're really young, when a human is really young, when your business is really young, flexibility is incredibly high, right? But then as we age, as we make decisions, as we implement systems, as we implement process, that flexibility starts to decrease. But then when you're really young, your control, your controllability, your predictability, that's really low. Like an infant, like an early stage business, who knows what's going to happen the next hour, the next week? That control and predictability is really low. And what we're trying to do is actually get to a point where we have good balance, right? What we call this prime position. We don't have all the flexibility in the world because that leads to problems, but we've got enough flexibility to respond to the world, and we've got good controls and good predictability. And on this growing side, if you listen to the Anear podcast, there's a leader that is in charge of a highly flexible organization that is able to develop some controls, but he then also talked about getting rid of unhealthy controls. But his leadership and his energy, he also talked about the little initiatives he'd set with new people. Hey, go and build this business. Here's some capital, you go and work it out, see if you can create a company. That is incredible flexibility that doesn't yet have controls and systems and risk aversion killing the place. And his whole energy is he can lead it. But if you look at Qantas and you look at aging organizations, there's this point where everything is so systemized, everything is so predictable, everything is so controlled at the expense of flexibility. And that is fine during the aristocracy phase because high controls and high predictability lead to great financial outcomes, lead to very predictable outcomes. But then what starts to happen is once you've entered this recrimination phase, a lot of that control and predictability starts to disappear, a bit like the aging phase. When you get into the really late phases of the life cycle, what do you generally get? Very angry, crotchety people that don't have any flexibility, and it's almost a return to infancy. And the CEOs of those organizations can't behave like Luke. It's just not possible because the relationship between flexibility and controllability is totally different.
And then just on that then, Don, do you think then it's a fait accompli for Vanessa and Qantas? Like if you're saying...
No.
Right.
So I always give in my life cycle presentations, the sad thing about life is that we know the human life cycle has to end. Like that's just the way the universe is. And the human life cycle, therefore, is just about trying to predict a few different things. With organizations, you can move between those squiggly lines if you apply the right approach for the right phase of the life cycle. So as an example, adolescence, once it starts, the entrepreneur can decide whether they want to spend their whole life in adolescence or if they want to effectively enter the aging phase. And just like Qantas at recrimination, if they handle it properly and they implement the process to handle it properly, they have the balance sheet, they have the brand to be able to move back into prime. And where that actually starts is understanding that before you say something is a problem in your organization, it's the same for Luke, it's the same for Qantas, we've first got to understand where we are in the life cycle. So I've got a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old and a 5-week-old, right? They don't sleep through the night. They need to wear nappies. They have no emotional control, are often unstable on their feet. Now, the other person in their house, let's say their father, when he has no emotional control, cries all the time, doesn't sleep through the night, wets himself, my long-suffering wife gets rather upset. Why do my children get away with that behaviour and dad doesn't? Why am I suddenly having to go and see a therapist? Well, it's normal for them. It's normal behaviour for them. It's abnormal for dad. So for dad, those problems we need to go and sort out. For the kids, we're not getting too upset about those problems. Our role is to help them move up the life cycle where those problems disappear by themselves. And so whether you're a growing company founder or you're on that aging life cycle, there will be normal problems of recrimination, aristocracy, and all of those life cycle positions. And what you've got to be able to do is understand what needs to be done in what sequence and how. And if you treat a recrimination company properly, you can get back. Just like if you treat a go-go company properly, just like if you treat an adolescent company, you can get to prime. And so one of the key points I always try and share with founders is, one, understand that your whole life in business is a world of problems, but that's an incredibly good thing because problems mean that you are alive. What you may be lacking is just a way of working out what are the problems that are important that I need to deal with and what are the problems that are going to disappear if I do the right things in the right sequence. Now, what is the reward that this universe gives you for solving all of the problems at a certain phase? The reward is all of the problems of the next phase. And what is also interesting with our brains is they look back on the previous phase's problems with fondness. And we often wish we could just go back to those simpler times, but then it just repeats phase after phase. And so a long-winded answer to your question, Lainey, is no, it's not inevitable. But what happens is if you're in that aging phase and you've got just too controlled and no flexibility, that's what we've got to start. We've got to start to get a bit of flexibility, a bit of reorientation. We've got to look at what are the controls that we've got to pull back. We've got to create that almost psychological safety for a little bit of risk taking, which is the total opposite of Luke at some point will want to do other things or the business will start entering a new phase. there are some things that business is going to need to prioritize, and the faster it gets the categorization of those things right, the faster it will come out the other end.
Yeah. And I think speed is going to be required for Qantas, just given the list we rattled off before about all the things that are going to need to be done. I think what was interesting about what you just said, though, Don, was that part of Qantas's problem is it had too many systems and too many processes, but also it seems like it's in this pickle because on certain very critical things, it didn't have systems and processes. So I guess what you're saying is flexibility is needed to get rid of the stuff that's not working for them, but apply the right sort of processes and systems where it's fallen down.
I always try and use the word healthy when trying to talk about all of these things, because it's actually healthy systems that we're talking about. And sometimes there is unhealthy or there's an absolute gap. And the final bit that I think partly answers that is, if you think of PAEI, everything should be with an I. Everything should have the human integration factor. And so when you're bringing in administration, systems, process, always try and do it in an I way. Always try and make sure that it's integrated with people, integrated with the other ingredients. And what we'll be going into the lifecycle workshop that we'll be doing in October is, how does PAEI play out through each of these phases? Because again, if you're Qantas and you know how it plays out, you can be proactive. If you're a founder at the other stage, how it plays out, how you can be proactive. And all I would say is health. Healthy is the word there, Lainey. All right, I'll stop.
That's super useful.
It is super useful. And there will be the link to that workshop in the show notes, obviously. But Don, would it be fair to say that there's often a transition of leadership in that recrimination phase? Is that where we often see a spillover?
Transition is not the right word. Revolving door.
Yeah.
How many CEOs did AMP or still going through? And this is why the life cycle isn't a time-based thing. It's condition-based thing. Companies can spend decades going through this. If you've got a big enough balance sheet like a Qantas and you've got shareholders that will underwrite capital raising, you can stay in this for a decade. Just like adolescence is the revolving door often with founders. Have a look at Twiggy Forrest, another plug. People coming in and out of that executive, coming in and out. Now, the founder will often say the people were the wrong people. No, the business hasn't yet retailored itself to handle other people of other styles, of other directions. And it becomes a revolving door until they do the right things in the right sequence to move to the next phase.
Yeah. And I also think there's an element that we haven't talked about, which is the media, the intense media focus that she is going to have to grapple with and the board is going to have to grapple with while trying to do all of those things at the same time, right? There's this concept of the Heisenberg principle where the observation of a system changes the way that system operates. And I think, if you think the media are observers of the system, they have a huge impact on this. And not just in the way factual reporting, just commentary, all of those things will change how the public views this, how shareholders view this. And bringing it back to Luke again, I posted an article that was written about Vanessa now facing the glass cliff, which is this concept that women get promoted into these, women are underestimated or underrepresented everywhere else, but get disproportionately promoted to CEO when a company is in deep doo-doo. And so that where the risk of it failing is really high, or people assume it can't be resuscitated. And Luke said, hey, maybe actually that won't happen and she's going to be a good leader and we should just let her get on with doing that. And he's absolutely right. And to call me out on that, because bloody hell, I know what it's like to have the media question you on that. And I certainly don't want to contribute to the pile-in and make her job more difficult. But it is very difficult to run a company and to do all of the things that are going to need to be done with this business while also dealing with a media firestorm, which it will be for a really long period of time.
Yeah.
Because it's newsworthy and it won't really matter what Qantas say, it won't matter what the PR boffins say, it won't matter how well they craft their message. Every word's going to be torn apart and analysed and treated with either skepticism, mockery, or optimism, and they're going to have to put their head down and get on with it, even with that in the background. And even this week, we saw Qantas the chair, Goida, trying to craft a narrative around Alan Joyce's premature resignation as him being a martyr, and no one was buying it. Media wasn't buying it.
But those are like own goals, though. That
no, totally. But I just mean, it won't matter what Qantas say, because people will see through it or have their own take. And so how do you do it with the backdrop of all of this consistent daily reporting?
Firstly, one of the comments I want to make is that at the recrimination phase, I actually believe that women armed with the right approach are actually probably going to be far better, because what you need is deep empathy and EQ. I know the glass cliff issue exists, but the leadership approach needs to have that. The problem is often they're not equipped with the right processes, both men and women. And then, as you point out here, the external factors. Luke is totally right, and he was right to make that comment. And if this was a private company behind private doors, they would still have some of the challenges. But what we've got is these external bombs that are going to keep coming from the media. Now, the astute watcher of this podcast on YouTube will wonder how I did a wardrobe change faster than the great T Swift, right? Now, full disclosure.
I love it. I love that you work Taylor in again. Yeah. This is awesome.
This podcast is actually being recorded a day apart, because halfway through yesterday, my phone started blowing up with an entity that I look after having a bit of a challenge that we were going to have Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10, Channel 2 at the doorstep. So suddenly had to go and resolve that. Now, what I have learnt, and a lot of empathy for Lainey and anybody else in this situation, that dealing with these external pressures is one thing. Dealing it with a time crisis, so you have to have a full release by 2 p.m, and that's 37 minutes away. What that time pressure does is now puts conflict under the microscope. It puts different agendas on the table. It puts different decision-making styles. It very clearly works out if there's maybe an authority issue that hasn't already been clarified. And suddenly you've got this time pressure where my average heart rate sits resting normally about 60. I spend 6 hours between 70 and 100. And that environment ain't a great environment for good decision-making, for calm, long-term thinking. And what it requires is boards and chairs to create the space that is required for CEOs to get on and do their job. I don't want to repeat it again, but you got to back them or sack them. And you've got to create that environment where they can go and do those things. But I will humbly submit Mr. Goida's press release of trying to make Alan a martyr just makes her job harder, because then it creates even more media, when shutting the fuck up is probably the best approach.
Yeah, and look, the temptation to try and wrestle back control of the narrative is strong, but I'm here to tell you it's useless. So I think the only way to deal with this when you're in the maelstrom of a media firestorm is just to get on with it and craft a narrative with behaviour and decisions, not with PR, press releases and comments to media, because those decisions and behaviour will get reported. May not happen today or tomorrow, but it will happen, and that will slowly change the narrative if those decisions and that behaviour set is
and Qantas has got the brand, the balance sheet, the cash flow, and the product.
Absolutely.
It is in this unbelievably prime position where it's like the core part of the economy with a brand that, okay, it's had some tarnish, but it's not. It's recoverable.
Now, I say it like that, like it's simple, and it is, but it's not easy.
No, especially when you're in the emotion of the moment, like exactly like Don described. But Eleni, I think your insights there are so valuable. And for a founder listening to this that hasn't been through that experience, it's so hard to understand that. But to have it filed in back of mind that in those moments, rather than react or try and control the narrative, focus on behaviours and action. And yeah, I think it's a challenging thing to feel until you're there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And look, I hope, dear listener, none of you ever have to deal with it because it is traumatic. And people say they get paid the big bucks. They can deal with it. Yeah, it's still very traumatic even when people get paid well to absorb it. So anything else we want to say on Qantas before we
learn from it?
Yeah, there's lots of lessons in there, isn't there? And there'll be more to come, no doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
If I was a betting person, unfortunately, the odds are stacked against the first CEO that comes in at the beginning of that recrimination phase. This is, I don't know if it's like a rebound relationship tends to have to. That's a dumb analogy. Anyway, there's normally a filler between being able to get to somewhere functional and the fact that the politicians were already coming at her the day that she had started just does not bode well.
No. I thought you were about to dissect my relationship life there for a moment. Don?
This is why I've got to be so careful. My best mate the other day, because he's listened to a few of the podcasts on the ride, he said, I was going to message you, but do you realise you can go through life without trying to piss everyone off? And I said, that's a good insight. I'll think about it.
I'll take that on board.
All right. I guess before we sign off, what are we all looking forward to this week?
I had to take a moment to think. I actually don't know what I'm looking forward to. How sad.
I'll kick it off, but I'm looking forward to the Rugby World Cup kicking off on Saturday morning. So I'm going to be up early for the next 50 days. I'm watching a lot of rugby, so I can't wait.
That's awesome. And for listeners who don't know, Jack is quite the rugby player. It's his sport of choice.
I'm a spectator now.
Don?
I think we're going to try and go to the farm for the weekend and take some building materials so I can finish the carport that I started about 8 years ago.
Nice.
Fantastic.
That's good.
Just making lists and ticking things off, Don. So I don't really have anything to look forward to this week. I remember one of the things my mum said to me in my 30s was she felt sorry for me because I had nothing to look forward to in life. Because I don't have kids and I'm not married.
Jeez.
And I just got reminded of that when I said that. So that's depressing. But I'm going to try and finish my book this weekend, the book that I've been reading, which is Never Split the Difference, about negotiation tactics, which is fascinating. When I finish it, we can talk about it because I think it might be a really interesting topic for the podcast.
Whilst your mother pumps you up with all that self-confidence, that's
good. It's her job. I've said it before. Yeah.
It's a good book, though. We should definitely unpack that.
What about you, Aaron?
I did just remember my daughter is performing at the school fete on Saturday, so I am really looking forward to that.
What is she performing?
A flute. So she's taken to the flute this year. She goes through her interests.
Is she
the latest thing? She just got into
the Lizzo.
Actually, I have no idea, but I'm looking forward to it. She's very excited. I'm very excited, so that'll be good.
You know what I did do this week, which was very exciting because I have managed to secure a Taylor Swift ticket, which is amazing. But I found out that it is the same concert that my friends from university have got tickets to. So,
wow,
how cool!
All my friends will be there as well. All my 3 friends will be there. And I booked my flights this week for it.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was exciting.
You got gouged your flights this week.
Yeah, Qantas have a lot of my money.
Wow.
That's for that flight.
And these are flights that are actually happening, I assume.
Let's hope so. Awesome. All right, guys, till next week.
All right. See you then.
See you then.